94. The radio crackled 3 times, then went silent. Captain Friedrich Weber stared at the receiver like it had just pronounced his death sentence. Because it had. 290,000 men, 72 days, and the order that came through that frozen January morning in 1943 was 2 words that would condemn them all: no retreat. Stalingrad wasn't supposed to end like this. Hell, it wasn't supposed to be Stalingrad at all. When the German Sixth Army rolled toward the Volga River in August of 1942, the objective was oil, the Caucasus oil fields. Control those, and you control the fuel that runs an entire war machine. Stalingrad was just a city in the way, a manufacturing center, a symbolic prize because it bore Stalin's name. Take it, move on, win the war. That was the plan. But wars don't follow plan. They follow blood. The city fought back like a cornered animal. Every factory became a fortress. Every apartment building became a killing ground. The Russians didn't defend Stalingrad. They drowned it in bodies and bullets until the Volga ran red and the rubble piles grew taller than the buildings they used to be. By November, the Germans held maybe 90% of the city, 90% of nothing, burnt-out shells, frozen corpses stacked like cordwood. And still, the fighting went on, room to room, floor to floor. Sometimes you'd kill a man in one corner of a building, and his buddy would kill you 3 rooms over, and neither side would hold the whole damn structure by nightfall. That's when the trap snapped shut. November 19th, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. Not in the city, around it, north and south, through the Romanian and Italian lines that were supposed to protect the German flanks. Those Allied units weren't equipped for a Russian winter offensive. They had World War I rifles and summer coats, and about as much chance as a candle in a hurricane. The Soviet pincers met at Kalach, west of Stalingrad, 4 days later. The encirclement was complete. An entire German army, the pride of the Wehrmacht, cut off and surrounded. 290,000 men in a frozen pocket 60 kilometers wide and 40 kilometers deep. And that's when Friedrich Weber heard those 2 words, no retreat. The order came from the top, from Hitler himself, sitting in his warm headquarters 1,000 miles away, staring at maps that didn't show the frostbite or the hunger or the reality of what encirclement actually meant. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, had promised the Führer that his planes could supply the pocket. 500 tons of supplies a day, food, ammunition, fuel, medicine, everything an army needs. Just hold position, the order said. Relief is coming. The air bridge will sustain you. Do not abandon Stalingrad. Göring's promise was a fantasy wrapped in a lie and sold as strategy. The Luftwaffe never came close to 500 tons. On the best days, they delivered 70. Most days, they delivered less. The Russian winter slammed the airports. Blizzards grounded whole squadrons. Soviet fighters turned the air corridors into shooting galleries. German transport planes fell out of the sky like wounded birds. Their cargo scattered across the snow. Their crews frozen in the wreckage. And even when the planes did make it through, what they carried was never enough. You can't feed 290,000 men on 70 tons of bread and ammunition. You can only watch them starve slower. By December, the rations were cut in half, then cut again. Soldiers were eating the horses, then eating the leather from their boots, then eating nothing at all and just pretending they weren't hungry while their bodies consumed themselves from the inside. The cold was worse than the hunger, 40 degrees below zero. Men lost fingers to frostbite while they slept, lost toes inside boots that froze solid overnight. The wounded didn't cry out anymore because crying took energy they didn't have, and the cold stole their voices anyway. Weber watched his company shrink, not from Russian bullets, from the cold and the hunger and the typhus that spread through the trenches like wildfire through dry grass. Men who'd survived 2 years of combat just sat down one morning and didn't get back up. Their bodies were too tired to keep fighting a war that had already been lost. But the order stood. No retreat. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus commanded the 6th Army, a cautious man, a staff officer promoted beyond his depth, trying to hold together an impossible situation with discipline and hope. He requested permission to break out, twice. Both times Hitler refused. Hold Stalingrad, tie down Soviet forces, wait for relief. Paulus was a soldier. Soldiers follow orders, even orders that kill them. The relief offensive came in December. Operation Winter Storm. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's finest commanders, driving northeast with the 4th Panzer Army to punch through the Soviet encirclement and link up with the 6th Army. For a few days, it looked possible. The Panzers got within 30 miles of the pocket. 30 miles. Close enough that the men in Stalingrad could hear the distant rumble of tank guns and allowed themselves to believe that salvation was coming. Then Manstein stopped. He didn't have the strength to push further. The Soviets were too strong, his supply lines too stretched, and another Soviet offensive was threatening to encircle his relief force the same way they'd encircled Stalingrad. He sent a message to Paulus. Break out now. Meet us halfway. It's your only chance." Paulus sent the message up the chain. Hitler's response came back within hours. "No retreat. Hold Stalingrad." So Manstein pulled back. The sounds of the tank guns faded. The relief force disappeared into the winter, and the men in the pocket understood, finally and completely, that no one was coming to save them. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. January 1943 was the month hope died. The Soviets launched their final offensive to crush the pocket. Not a quick strike, a methodical grind, artillery barrages that lasted hours, infantry assaults that pushed the German perimeter inward, meter by meter, day by day. The pocket shrank. 60 kilometers became 50. 50 became 40. The airfields were overrun. Now even the trickle of supplies stopped completely. Weber's position was in the southern part of the pocket, near a ruined factory that didn't have a name anymore, just coordinates on a map. His company was down to 38 men. They'd started with 140. The rest were dead, missing, or too sick to fight. The ones who remained were skeletons in uniform, hollow eyes, skin stretched tight over skulls. They didn't talk much. Talking required energy, and energy was a currency they couldn't afford to spend. The Russians came at dawn. They always came at dawn. Weber heard the Katyusha rockets first. The sound was like a freight train being dragged across sheet metal. Then the explosion. The ground shook. The factory walls, already barely standing, shuddered and dropped more bricks into the snow. When the barrage lifted, the infantry came, wave after wave. They didn't use tactics anymore. They didn't need to. They just walked forward, and the Germans didn't have enough bullets to stop them. Weber's men fired until their rifles jammed from the cold. Then they fought with entrenching tools and frozen hands and desperation. The Russians took the factory by noon. Weber and 11 survivors fell back to the next position, a basement, a hole in the ground with a roof that might or might not hold. They waited for the next assault and knew it was coming because the assaults always came. That night, Weber got new orders: not to attack, not to defend, to wait. The Sixth Army was being split into two pockets now, northern and southern. Communication between them was breaking down. Command structure was collapsing. Officers were making decisions based on rumors and guesswork because the radio networks were failing and the messengers weren't making it through the lines. One of Weber's men asked the question they were all thinking. "Sir, when do we break out?" Weber didn't answer, because the answer was never. The order was still no retreat. By the end of January, the southern pocket collapsed. Paulus was in the northern pocket, in the basement of a department store that had been converted into a headquarters. The Soviets were offering surrender terms. Paulus sent another request to Hitler: permission to surrender, permission to save what was left of his men. Hitler's response was to promote him. January 30th, Paulus was made a field marshal. The message was clear: no German field marshal had ever surrendered. The promotion was an order to die with honor rather than live with shame. Paulus surrendered the next day. He didn't see the point in dying for symbolism. His men were starving. They were freezing. They were out of ammunition and medical supplies and hope. Continuing the fight wouldn't change the outcome. It would just add more bodies to the count. On February 2nd, 1943, the last German resistance in Stalingrad ended. 91,000 men went into Soviet captivity. Most of them would never come home. The Soviets marched them east, into camps where the cold and disease and forced labor finished what the battle had started. Of the 91,000 captured, only about 6,000 ever saw Germany again. Weber was one of them. He survived the surrender, survived the march to the camps, survived 5 years of captivity in Siberia, eating sawdust bread and working in coal mines and watching men die around him every single day. He came home in 1948, 40 pounds lighter than when he'd left, with frostbite scars on his hands and memories that didn't fade. He never talked about Stalingrad, not to his wife, not to his children. What was there to say? That the order to hold had killed more German soldiers than any battle in history. That 290,000 men had been sacrificed for a city that didn't matter, on the orders of a man who didn't understand what he was asking. The no-retreat order at Stalingrad was sold as strategic necessity. Hold the city, tie down Soviet forces, wait for relief. In reality, it was a death sentence written by pride and delusion. The Sixth Army could have broken out in November, when the encirclement was fresh and the Soviet lines were still thin. They could have saved most of the men, but the order was to hold, and soldiers follow orders. The consequences rippled far beyond Stalingrad. Germany lost an entire field army, veteran troops that couldn't be replaced, equipment that couldn't be rebuilt fast enough. The psychological blow was even worse. Stalingrad was supposed to be proof of German invincibility. Instead, it became proof that the war was lost. The German people heard the news in February 1943, and for the first time, they understood that victory wasn't coming. The myth of the unstoppable Wehrmacht died in the rubble of a city that no longer existed. The Soviets, on the other hand, found their turning point. Stalingrad became the symbol of Soviet resistance, the place where the invader was stopped, surrounded, and destroyed. The propaganda value was immense, but the real value was strategic. The Red Army learned it could win. It could outfight, outmaneuver, and outlast the Germans. From Stalingrad forward, the Soviets never stopped advancing. The individual stories from the pocket are harder to quantify. Weber's story was one of 91,000. Most of those men didn't leave stories. They left frozen bodies in trenches and mass graves and unmarked spots in the snow. The ones who survived captivity came home to a Germany that didn't want to hear about defeat. They carried Stalingrad inside them like shrapnel, pieces of trauma embedded so deep that removing them would cause more damage than leaving them in place. The families never got closure. A man disappeared into the pocket in November and was declared missing in February and might or might not be in a Soviet camp or a mass grave, or scattered across the steppe in pieces too small to identify. The uncertainty was its own kind of torture, worse than knowing, because not knowing meant you couldn't stop hoping. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The order itself, no retreat, wasn't unique to Stalingrad. Hitler issued similar orders throughout the war: stand fast, hold at all costs, no withdrawal without permission. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes refusing to retreat prevented a collapse that would have been worse than the losses from holding position. But Stalingrad wasn't one of those times. Stalingrad was encirclement. The only way to hold position when you're surrounded is to die in position. The air supply failure was the cruelest part. Göring's promise gave Hitler the excuse to order the stand. If the Luftwaffe could actually deliver 500 tons a day, holding the pocket might have been feasible. Not pleasant, not without cost, but feasible. The men could eat. The wounded could be evacuated. Ammunition could be replenished. But Göring's promise was based on fantasy math and peacetime conditions, and an absolute refusal to acknowledge reality. When the planes couldn't deliver, when the losses mounted and the weather grounded the flights and the tonnage never came close to the promised amount, Göring didn't admit failure. He blamed the army for requiring too much, blamed the weather for being too harsh, blamed everyone except himself for making a promise he couldn't keep. And the men in the pocket paid for it. They paid with frostbitten limbs and empty stomachs and slow deaths in frozen trenches. They paid with hope that turned to despair when the supply drops didn't come. They paid with their lives because someone 1,000 miles away made a promise he didn't have to keep. Paulus has been criticized for not defying the order, for not breaking out on his own authority when it became clear that holding the pocket was suicide. He had the rank, he had the responsibility, and he followed orders instead of saving his men. But defying Hitler in 1943 meant more than personal consequences. It meant court-martial. It meant execution, not just for Paulus, but potentially for his staff. It meant branding your entire command as traitors. And for what? To save men who might die in the breakout anyway? Paulus chose loyalty to the chain of command over rebellion. Right or wrong, that choice defined him. Weber never blamed Paulus. He blamed the cold, the hunger, the situation that made every choice a bad one. You can't fight when you're starving, can't march when your feet are frozen, can't break out when the Russians have you surrounded on all sides, and your vehicles won't start because the oil has frozen solid and your men are too weak to walk more than a few hundred meters without collapsing. The breakout would have been a slaughter in motion instead of a slaughter in place. Different, but not better. The question that haunted the survivors was simple. Why? Why hold a city that was already destroyed? Why sacrifice an army for a name on a map? The strategic explanations never satisfied. Tying down Soviet forces, protecting the flank, maintaining the line. All true in the narrow tactical, but the cost was too high. You don't trade an entire field army for tactical delay. You don't condemn 290,000 men to death or captivity for a few more weeks of operational flexibility. The real answer was harder to accept: pride, ideology, the refusal to admit that a decision was wrong, because admitting it was wrong meant admitting that the entire strategy was flawed. Hitler had ordered the Wehrmacht to take Stalingrad. German soldiers had bled for months to take it. Giving it up, even when surrounded, even when holding it meant destruction, would be admitting defeat. And Hitler didn't admit defeat, ever. Not until the very end, when there was nothing left to defend and nowhere left to retreat to. So the order stood: no retreat. And the 6th Army died. The 72 days from encirclement to surrender were a slow-motion catastrophe. Every day the pocket shrank. Every day more men died. Every day the chances of relief or breakout or survival diminished. And every day, the order remained the same. Hold, wait, die in place if you must, but do not retreat. Weber remembered the silence most of all, not the explosions or the gunfire, the silence between the attacks, the way sound disappeared in the cold, the way men stopped talking because there was nothing left to say, the way the pocket felt like a graveyard before everyone was actually dead, like the outcome was already decided, and they were just waiting for the formality of the ending. When the surrender came, it felt less like relief and more like confirmation. This is how it ends. Not with a heroic last stand, not with a breakthrough or a rescue, with starvation and frostbite and surrender to an enemy that hated you as much as you'd been taught to hate them. The Soviets weren't gentle with the prisoners. They'd seen what the Germans had done to their country, the burned villages, the mass executions, the siege of Leningrad. They had no sympathy for starving Wehrmacht soldiers who cried about the cold. They marched them east and worked them until they dropped and buried them in unmarked graves when they did. Weber survived because he was lucky. No other reason. He didn't get typhus when the epidemic swept through his camp. Didn't get pneumonia when the winter turned brutal. Didn't get selected for the work details that killed men through exhaustion. Just luck. Random chance. The same chance that killed the man sleeping next to him and spared him for another day. He came home to a Germany that had been split in half and occupied by the victors. His city was rubble. His family was scattered. The country he'd fought for didn't exist anymore. And the war he'd survived had been for nothing. Worse than nothing. It had been for destruction, for death, for a cause that history would judge as evil. The weight of that knowledge was heavier than the memories of the cold. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. Stalingrad changed how wars were understood. It proved that industrial warfare could consume entire armies, that supply lines mattered more than bravery, that no amount of tactical skill could overcome strategic stupidity. The lessons were written in frozen corpses and mass graves, and the ruined shells of buildings that would take decades to rebuild. For the Soviets, it was validation, proof that the Red Army could win, that the sacrifices of 1941 and 1942, the millions of dead, the scorched earth retreats, the desperate defenses, had not been in vain. Stalingrad was where the tide turned, where the unstoppable German advance became stoppable, where the myth of blitzkrieg died in the streets of a city that refused to fall. For the Germans, it was the beginning of the end, the realization that the war was lost. Not immediately. There would be 2 more years of fighting, 2 more years of retreats and defeats, and desperate counterattacks that gained nothing. But the outcome was decided at Stalingrad. Everything after was just prolonging the inevitable. Weber understood this in a way that most people didn't. He'd been there. He'd watched the pocket shrink and the men die, and the hope drain away like water through a sieve. He knew that the war was lost the moment the encirclement closed. Everything after, the promises of relief and the orders to hold and the promotions and the propaganda, was just theater. A performance staged for an audience that didn't want to admit the show was over. The individual tragedies were countless. The soldier who froze to death the night before the surrender. The medic who died from typhus after treating hundreds of patients with no medicine and no hope. The pilot who was shot down delivering supplies that never reached the men who needed them. Every one of those deaths was a story, a life cut short, a family left behind, a future erased. And all of it, every single death, came back to 2 words: no retreat. Orders shape wars. Wars shape nations shape history, and history judges the orders that were given. The no retreat command at Stalingrad has been judged harshly, not just because it failed. Plenty of orders fail, but because it failed predictably. Because everyone on the ground, everyone who understood the reality of encirclement and winter and supply shortages, knew it would fail, and they were ordered to follow it anyway. Weber never forgave that. Not Hitler, not the generals, not the system that valued obedience over survival. He'd followed the orders because that's what soldiers do, but he never forgave them. The cost was too high. 290,000 men in 72 days, an entire army consumed by cold and hunger, and the refusal to admit a mistake. The survivors carried scars that never healed. The families carried losses that were never explained. The nation carried a defeat that marked the turning point from expansion to collapse. And it all started with 2 words from a man who never had to stand in the cold and watch his friends die. No retreat. Weber lived into his 80s. He saw Germany rebuild, saw the wall go up and come down, saw his children grow and his grandchildren born. He never went back to Stalingrad, never wanted to. The city was rebuilt into Volgograd, and the battlefield became a memorial, and tourists walked the ground where he'd nearly died. But he stayed home, because the Stalingrad he remembered wasn't a place. It was a feeling. The cold, the hunger, the hopelessness. And you don't revisit that. You carry it, every day, until the day you don't have to carry it anymore. His story is one of thousands. Thousands of men who followed orders that killed them. Thousands of families who never got answers. Thousands of frozen graves that don't have names. Stalingrad wasn't just a battle. It was a monument to the cost of pride. A reminder that orders, no matter how confident or official or absolute, can be wrong. And when they're wrong on that scale, the consequences are measured in generations. The Hook promised an impossible decision. Here it is. Friedrich Weber and 290,000 others were given a choice that wasn't a choice. Obey the order and die. Disobey the order and die as a traitor. There was no third option, no escape, no relief, just 72 days of cold and hunger and death, all because someone far away decided that retreat was worse than annihilation. They followed the order. They held the city. They died in place. And history remembers them not as heroes, but as victims of a command that should never have been given. No retreat, 2 words, 290,000 lives, 72 days of frozen hell that ended the same way it was always going to end. Not with victory, not with rescue, with surrender and captivity and the knowledge that every death, every frozen corpse, every starving soldier could have been avoided if someone had just admitted the truth. The battle was lost. The war was lost. And no amount of holding position was going to change that. But the order stood, and the men obeyed, because that's what soldiers do, even when the orders kill them. The surrender didn't bring relief. It brought only a different form of hell. When Weber and the survivors emerged from the basements and trenches in February 1943, they didn't look like soldiers. They looked like specters, ghosts dressed in tattered uniforms that hung from bodies that had consumed themselves. The Soviet soldiers who captured them stared in disbelief. These were the invaders who had rolled across their country with tanks and confidence. These skeletal figures who could barely walk. The march east began immediately. No rest, no medical care, no food beyond what the Soviets could spare, which was almost nothing. The Red Army was fighting a war. They didn't have supplies to waste on prisoners who'd burned their villages and killed their people, so the Germans walked east toward the camps, away from everything they'd known, into a captivity that would last years for the lucky ones and forever for most. Weber watched men fall during the march. They'd take a few steps, stumble, collapse into the snow, and not get up. The column kept moving. The Soviets didn't stop for the fallen. You either kept pace or you died where you dropped. Simple mathematics, brutal efficiency, no different than the logic that had trapped them in Stalingrad in the first place. The camps were scattered across Siberia, coal mines mostly. Labor camps where prisoners worked until they couldn't work anymore, then died and were replaced by the next transport. The Soviets called it re-education. The prisoners called it slavery. Both were right. The work was designed to break you. 14-hour shifts in mines where the temperature never rose above freezing, minimal food, no medical care, guards who viewed you as subhuman because of what your army had done to their country. Weber ended up at Camp 5-110 near Stalinsk, a coal mine operation that processed thousands of prisoners and returned almost none. He arrived in March 1943, weighing maybe 90 pounds. The camp commandant took one look at the new arrivals and assigned half of them to the hospital barracks. Not for treatment, for dying. The other half, including Weber, went to the mines. The work was simple. Go underground, fill carts with coal, push the carts to the surface, repeat until your shift ended or you collapsed. Weber's first day underground, he saw a man get crushed when a support beam failed. The beam fell, the man screamed, then went silent. The other prisoners moved the beam, pulled out the body, and kept working. No ceremony, no pause. Death was ordinary, expected. Not worth stopping production. The days blurred together. Wake before dawn. Eat a bowl of watery soup with a piece of bread that was mostly sawdust. March to the mine. Work until dark. March back. Eat another bowl of soup. Sleep in a barracks where the men were packed so tightly that you slept on your side because there wasn't room to lie on your back. Then wake and do it again. Weber survived the first winter in the camp through sheer stubbornness. He'd survived Stalingrad. He'd survived the surrender and the march. He wasn't going to die in a mine shaft for the entertainment of guards who hated him. So, he worked. He ate every scrap of food they gave him, no matter how disgusting. He slept when he could. He avoided the guards and the camp criminals who preyed on the weak. He became invisible, a gray figure who didn't cause problems and didn't attract attention. Others weren't as careful or as lucky. A prisoner who complained about the rations got beaten and thrown into solitary confinement, which was a concrete hole in the ground with no heat and no light. He froze to death in 3 days. A prisoner who stole bread from another prisoner was killed by his fellow inmates, who couldn't risk the guards punishing the entire barracks for one man's theft. A prisoner who tried to escape was caught within hours, brought back to the camp, and shot in front of everyone as a lesson. The lesson was clear. There was no escape, no rescue, no hope of anything except survival. And survival meant work and obedience and becoming less than human, so that being treated as less than human didn't destroy you. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The years crawled past. 1943 became 1944. The war continued somewhere beyond the camp walls, but the prisoners had no information. Rumors spread constantly. Germany was winning. Germany was losing. The Americans had landed in France. The Russians were in Berlin. Hitler was dead. Hitler had escaped. None of it could be verified. None of it mattered. The war could end tomorrow or never, and the men in Camp 5110 would still be mining coal until they died. Weber marked time by the seasons. Summer meant the barracks were merely cold instead of frozen. Winter meant men died faster. Spring meant the snow melted and revealed the bodies of prisoners who died during the winter and been stacked outside like cordwood until the ground thawed enough to bury them. Fall meant preparing for the next winter and wondering if you'd survive it. He made one friend in the camp, a man named Otto from Bavaria who'd been captured at Stalingrad the same day as Weber. They worked the same shifts, slept in the same barracks, shared the unspoken understanding that talking about home or family or the future was pointless. You talked about the present, the work, the guards, the small victories like finding an extra potato in your soup or avoiding a beating. Otto died in the winter of 1946, pneumonia. His lungs filled with fluid, and he drowned slowly over the course of a week while the camp doctor did nothing because medicine was reserved for prisoners who might recover and return to work. Weber sat with him the night he died. Didn't say anything, just sat there while Otto's breathing got slower and shallower and finally stopped. Then Weber went back to work the next morning, because that's what you did. You kept working, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant they'd won. The camp population turned over constantly. New prisoners arrived from other camps or from the war as it ground toward its conclusion. Old prisoners died or were transferred or simply disappeared. By 1947, Weber was one of the longest-serving prisoners at Camp 5110. He knew the mine layouts better than some of the guards, knew which foremen were cruel and which were merely indifferent, knew how to stretch his rations and where to find scraps, and how to make a week's worth of bread last 8 days if necessary. He also knew that most men who'd been in the camp as long as he had were dead. The survival rate beyond 3 years was almost zero. The work destroyed your body. The cold destroyed your health. The hunger destroyed your strength. Eventually, something gave out. Your heart, your lungs, your will, and you joined the bodies stacked outside the barracks waiting for burial. But Weber kept working, kept surviving, because the alternative was unacceptable. The war ended in May 1945. The prisoners didn't know for months. When they finally heard, the reaction was muted. Germany had lost, the Third Reich was destroyed, Hitler was dead. So what? The guards didn't release the prisoners. The work didn't stop. The war ending just meant that the prisoners were now convicted war criminals instead of prisoners of war. The distinction was legal. The reality was identical. The releases began slowly in 1947. Not for everyone. The Soviets kept the officers and anyone suspected of war crime, but ordinary soldiers, men who'd just followed orders and fought and surrendered, started being processed for release. Weber's name appeared on a list in April 1948, 5 years and 2 months after his capture. He was given a set of civilian clothes that didn't fit, a loaf of bread, and instructions to report to a processing center 300 kilometers away. He walked most of the distance, caught rides when he could, slept in ditches and abandoned buildings. The Soviet Union was a wasteland, not from the war, though the war had certainly contributed, from decades of brutality and mismanagement and a system that valued ideology over human life. Weber saw collective farms where people were starving, saw cities where buildings crumbled and no one repaired them, saw a nation that had won the war and lost everything else. The processing center was chaos. Thousands of released prisoners trying to get documentation and transportation home. Weber waited 3 weeks for his papers, then waited another 2 weeks for a train heading west. The train was a cattle car packed with other released prisoners, all of them skeletal and sick and silent. They didn't celebrate, didn't sing, didn't even talk much. They just sat and waited for the train to carry them home. The border crossing into occupied Germany was surreal. Soviet guards on one side, Western Allied guards on the other, and in between, a line in the dirt that represented everything that had changed. Weber crossed it in July 1948, 5 years and 5 months after Stalingrad. He was 31 years old. He looked 50. Germany was divided, occupied, destroyed. The cities he remembered were rubble fields with people living in the ruins. The country he'd fought for didn't exist. It had been split into zones controlled by the Americans, British, French, and Soviets. The border between East and West was hardening into a permanent division, and the people, his people, were trying to rebuild from nothing while the occupiers decided their fate. Weber made his way to his hometown in the American zone. It took him a week. The town was smaller than he remembered, quieter, older. Half the buildings were gone. The church where he'd been baptized was a shell with no roof and broken walls. The school where he'd learned to read was a pile of bricks. The house where he'd grown up was occupied by strangers who'd moved in after his family had been evacuated during an air raid. He found his mother living with his sister in a 2-room apartment that housed 6 people. His father had died in an air raid in 1944. His brother had been killed on the Eastern Front in 1943. His mother was 62 and looked 80. She cried when she saw him. Not from joy, from grief, because seeing him alive meant remembering everyone who wasn't. Weber didn't stay long. The apartment was too crowded. The memories were too heavy, and he didn't fit anymore. The man who'd left in 1941 had been young and confident, and convinced he was fighting for something that mattered. The man who came back in 1948 was hollow, used up, a survivor who'd outlived his purpose. He moved to a displaced persons camp run by the Americans, got a job doing manual labor, clearing rubble, building roads, anything that required a strong back and no questions. He didn't talk about the war, didn't talk about Stalingrad, didn't talk about the camps. What was there to say? That he'd followed orders and watched friends die and survive through luck? That the war had been for nothing and the suffering had been pointless? The people around him were trying to move forward. Looking back only made it harder. He met his wife in 1950, a widow whose husband had died in Normandy. She had 2 children and no prospects, and was willing to marry a man who didn't talk about his past as long as he provided stability. Weber did. He worked, came home, didn't drink, didn't hit, didn't cause problems. It wasn't love, it was survival. 2 damaged people building something functional from the wreckage of their lives. They had a child together in 1952, a daughter. Weber held her for the first time and felt nothing. No joy, no connection, just the distant recognition that he was supposed to feel something and couldn't. The war had taken that too, the ability to feel things that weren't fear or hunger or cold. But he tried. He worked to provide for his family, taught his daughter to read, attended school functions and church services, and did all the things that normal fathers did. And if he woke up at night sweating and shaking from dreams about frozen trenches and starving men, he didn't tell anyone. He just went back to sleep and got up the next morning and went to work. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The German economic miracle of the 1950s passed him by. Other men got rich rebuilding the country. Weber got by. He had a job, a family, a roof over his head. That was enough. More than enough. More than most of the men from Stalingrad had. He thought about them sometimes. The ones who died in the pocket. The ones who died in the camps. The ones who'd made it home and then killed themselves because living with the memories was worse than dying. He'd heard stories. A former comrade who'd walked into a lake and kept walking until the water closed over his head. Another who'd hanged himself in his garage on the anniversary of the surrender. Another who'd simply stopped eating and wasted away over the course of months while his family watched helplessly. Weber understood. The war didn't end when the fighting stopped. It ended when the last veteran died and took the memories with him. Until then, it was always February 1943, always cold, always hungry, always waiting for relief that never came. His daughter asked about the war once. She was 12, studying history in school. The teacher had assigned a project about World War II. She wanted to know what her father had done. Weber looked at her for a long moment, then said, "I survived. That was all." She pressed for details. Where had he fought? What had he seen? Had he been a hero? Weber shook his head. There were no heroes, just men who followed orders and died. She didn't understand. How could she? She'd grown up in a peaceful Germany where the worst thing that happened was running out of butter at the store. She had no framework for understanding Stalingrad, no context for orders that killed more men than enemy bullets. So Weber didn't explain. He just went back to reading his newspaper and let her write her report based on textbooks that turned the war into dates and statistics and lessons about why it had been wrong. The decades passed. Germany reunified. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War ended. The veterans aged and died. The memorials went up. The textbooks got longer. And Weber kept living, working until he retired, watching his grandchildren grow up, attending funerals for men he'd served with, and sharing silent nods with the other survivors because words were inadequate. He went to one Stalingrad reunion. 1993, 50 years after the battle. A gathering of survivors in a hotel in Munich. There were maybe 40 men there, out of 290,000. They sat in a conference room and didn't say much. What was there to say? They'd all been there. They all knew. One man stood up and tried to give a speech about honor and duty and sacrifice. Weber walked out. Honor was for people who had choices. Duty was for people who believed in the cause. Sacrifice was for people who died for something that mattered. Stalingrad was none of those things. It was waste, pure waste, and dressing it up with patriotic language didn't change that. He never went to another reunion. By the time he reached his 80s, most of the people from his past were gone. His wife died in 1998. His daughter moved to Hamburg. His grandchildren visited occasionally but had their own lives. Weber lived alone in a small apartment with his memories and his silence. A journalist contacted him in 2002, writing a book about Stalingrad, wanted to interview survivors. Weber agreed because he was old and tired and didn't see the point in refusing. They sat in his apartment for 3 hours. The journalist asked questions. Weber answered, factual, brief, without emotion. The journalist kept pushing for feelings. What did it feel like when the encirclement closed, when the rations were cut, when the order came to surrender? Weber stared at him and finally said, "It felt like dying slowly, and knowing you were dying, and not being able to stop it." The journalist wrote that down like it was profound. Weber knew it wasn't. It was just true. The book came out in 2004. Weber's story was one chapter among many. He read it once. The journalist had tried to make it dramatic, heroic even. Weber closed the book and put it on a shelf and never looked at it again. Because it wasn't his story. His story was the cold and the hunger and the 5 years in a Siberian coal mine and the 40 years after trying to be normal while carrying the weight of all that death. You couldn't put that in a book. You could only live it. Weber died in 2006, 89 years old, heart failure, quick and painless according to the doctors. His daughter arranged a small funeral. A few neighbors attended. A priest who hadn't known him said generic words about eternal rest. They buried him in a cemetery on the outskirts of town. No military honors, no flag on the coffin, no mention of Stalingrad, just a quiet burial for a man who'd survived when most hadn't. His daughter cleaned out his apartment afterward, found a box in the back of a closet. Inside were his discharge papers from 1948, a photograph of his unit from 1941, before Stalingrad, when they'd still look like soldiers instead of corpses, and a small notebook filled with names, pages and pages of names, written in careful script, no dates, no explanations, just names. His daughter realized what it was. The men from his unit, the ones who died at Stalingrad or in the camps or in the years after. Weber had written them all down, remembered them when no one else would, carried their names for 60 years because someone had to. She closed the notebook and put it back in the box, took it home, put it in her own closet, because destroying it felt wrong and keeping it felt necessary, even if she didn't fully understand why. The order to hold Stalingrad killed 290,000 men, but it didn't kill them all at once. It killed them in the pocket, in the camps, in the years and decades after when the war wouldn't let them go. It killed them slowly, methodically, relentlessly. Friedrich Weber survived 72 days of encirclement, 5 years of captivity, and 63 years of carrying the weight of what he'd witnessed. He survived longer than almost anyone else from the Sixth Army, and when he finally died, what remained wasn't the survival. It was the names in a notebook, the proof that all those men had existed, had fought, had died. That was the real cost of no retreat, not just the deaths, the erasure, the forgetting, the way 290,000 lives became a statistic in a history book, a lesson about strategic failures and tactical mistakes, as if they were chess pieces instead of men, instead of husbands and fathers and sons and brothers who'd followed orders and paid with everything they had. Weber's story is finished, but the lesson remains. Orders matter. Leaders matter. And when orders are given from comfort and safety to men who'll die following them, those orders should be absolute, final, irrevocable. Because if you're going to order men to die, you better be certain it's for something more than pride. Stalingrad wasn't, and 72 days proved it.